I inherited a large stretch of mountain property from my family years ago, acreage so remote and so far from the nearest neighborhood that I'd visit maybe once or twice a year, just to walk the boundaries and make sure nothing had changed. It was a kind of land that mostly takes care of itself. Quiet, forgotten by most people who knew it existed. Exactly how I liked it. One weekend, I made the drive up for a routine check. The road was the same as always, until it wasn't. Fresh tire tracks cut across an access road that should have been empty for months. Deep grooves from heavy vehicles. The kind of traffic pattern that doesn't happen by accident. I followed them deeper onto the property, telling myself there was probably a simple explanation. There wasn't. What I found in the middle of my land was a luxury log cabin under active construction. Not a shed, not a hunting blind. A massive custom-built structure with workers on the roof, construction vehicles parked across the clearing, and pallets of premium building materials stacked everywhere. The kind of materials that don't come cheap and don't show up on a property by mistake. I sat in my truck for a moment with the engine running, pulled out my property map, and checked it against the survey markers I could see from where I'd parked. Then I checked again. The structure sat squarely, unambiguously, inside my property lines. Not near them, inside them. I got out and asked for the site manager. A short time later, a woman introduced herself as the HOA president for the residential community several miles down the mountain. She explained, with the kind of breezy confidence that suggests someone has never been seriously questioned before, that the association had authority to build here. The cabin, she said, was going to become a private retreat for HOA members, a value add for the whole community. When I asked her directly for proof of ownership or for the building permits, she didn't answer either question. She just repeated that everything had already been approved. Everything about that sentence bothered me. So the next morning, I drove to the county records office and requested every document connected to the parcel. What I learned took about 20 minutes to confirm and completely reframe the situation. The property had never been transferred. No easement existed granting anyone access or development rights. No sale, no lease, no agreement of any kind appeared anywhere in the chain of title. The land was exactly as it had always been, legally mine. I went next to the county building department and asked about permits for the cabin. The search came back empty. No building permit had ever been issued for that structure. No inspections had been scheduled. No plans had been submitted for review. A luxury cabin, the kind that probably ran into six figures of materials alone, was being built from the ground up with zero legal authorization of any kind. I called a property attorney that afternoon. He didn't need long to form an opinion. We assembled everything. Survey maps, the county's confirmation that no transfer had occurred, the building department's confirmation that no permits existed, photographs of the active construction site, and within days filed an emergency motion for a stop work order. The court moved fast. Construction halted immediately. Workers packed up and left. The clearing that had been full of activity went completely silent, almost overnight. County inspectors then conducted their own independent investigation, documenting multiple violations and posting official notices directly on the unfinished structure. Every new piece of documentation added weight to a case that was already, frankly, not close. The HOA tried to mount a defense. Board meetings featured arguments about community benefit and increased property values, the kind of language that sounds reasonable until someone in the room asked the obvious follow-up question. Where are the permits? And how exactly did the association gain access to private land in the first place? Once homeowners started asking that question, the association's leadership found themselves with very few satisfying answers and a growing number concerned residents. While the legal process moved forward, my attorney and I walked the site together. Up close, the scale of the project was almost impressive. Custom stonework, premium timber framing, architectural details that represented real expertise and real money. Someone had poured significant resources into this build, and none of it had so much as a permit number attached to it. One development during the proceedings stood out. The contractor who'd been hired to build a cabin testified that the HOA had assured him, before construction began, that every necessary approval had already been secured. He said he'd taken that representation at face value and proceeded accordingly, that testimony mattered. It established that the contractor had been operating in good faith based on assurances from people who apparently had no basis for making them. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the evidence was about as conclusive as evidence gets. Survey maps confirmed ownership. County records confirmed no transfer had ever taken place. Building officials confirmed no permits had been issued. Violation notices documented the unauthorized construction in detail. Each piece corroborated every other piece. The HOA president took the stand, under oath, with a documentary record sitting in front of her. She acknowledged that the association had never obtained legal ownership of the parcel, and that construction had begun without valid building permits. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a courtroom when someone admits, under oath, to something the documents had already proven, and that's the silence that followed her testimony. The judge's ruling didn't take long to come together after that. The cabin was declared an unlawful structure, built on private property without authorization of any kind. The court issued an order permitting its removal. I called a demolition company the same day I received the signed order. Their crew showed up the next morning with excavators and heavy equipment, established safety zones, ran their pre-operation checks, and got ready to undo months of unauthorized work. The HOA president arrived just as preparations were wrapping up, asking what was happening. I handed her a copy of the signed court order. She read through every page. There was nothing left to argue and no authority left to invoke. The position she'd taken on day one, that everything was approved, that this was all settled, had been tested all the way through a courtroom and had not survived contact with a single document. The demolition itself took most of the day. The first impact sent a wave of dust into the clearing. Custom timber framing that had taken a skilled crew weeks to assemble came down in pieces within hours. Walls collapsed. Roofing sections were lifted away and cleared. The HOA president stood at a distance and watched the structure she had defended in two separate legal proceedings come apart piece by piece, exactly as the court had ordered. By evening, the clearing held nothing but piles of stone, timber, and construction debris waiting for haul-off. County officials inspected the site afterward and confirmed the removal had been completed in full compliance with the court's order. The fallout for the HOA didn't stop there. Residents who had been told this was a community benefit project demanded answers about how leadership had operated with zero legal basis for months. Emergency meetings followed. Questions about board oversight, financial accountability, and decision-making authority dominated neighborhood conversation for weeks. I went back up the mountain the next morning. The clearing was quiet again, that same specific quiet I'd always associated with this land, the kind that exists because almost nobody comes here. The cabin was gone. The ground was clear. The dispute, for all its courtroom drama and demolition equipment, was over. What stayed with me wasn't the cabin itself, or even the demolition. It was a simple fact that an organization with real resources, real influence over hundreds of residents, and a board full of people who should have known better had built a six-figure structure on land they had never owned, never surveyed, never received permission to touch, based on nothing but the assumption that nobody would check. Somebody always checks eventually. In this case, it just happened to be the actual owner on a routine weekend drive, following tire tracks that shouldn't have been there. The land is back to what it's always been. Quiet. Mine. Exactly where it belongs.